Yes, I think the broadcast is live. So welcome to tonight's discussion about the fight or winning the fight for free speech, which is undoubtedly under attack in this country. We see Julian Assange incarcerated in Belmarsh prison, fighting extradition to the US for exposing war crimes. We have anti-racist socialists being suspended and expelled from the Labour Party for expressing solidarity with the Palestinian people, or for speaking out against the routine atrocities perpetrated by the settler colonial Israeli regime. And dissenting voices are rarely, if ever, given a platform on the mainstream media these days. So clearly there is a major issue there. It's not a new phenomenon, of course. We know that free speech has been under attack for some time now, but certainly the election of Jeremy Corbyn as the Labour leader saw efforts to limit free speech going into overdrive, not least because the policies that Corbyn was promoting posed a threat to the military-industrial complex in this country, with his emphasis on peace and disarmament and an ethical foreign policy programme. And of course, his commitment to redistribution of income and wealth sent the establishment into apoplexy, and clearly they wanted to suppress those voices, which were gaining quite a lot of traction, I think, with the general public in this country. But Britain, used to pride itself, didn't it, on free speech. So what we're going to be discussing tonight is how do we fight back? What do we do? How do we get here? And we've got some excellent guests who will be speaking in tonight's discussion. The first of whom is Tony Greenstein, who's a prolific blogger and a founding member of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Marc Wadsworth, who is an author and a long-standing anti-racism campaigner. Also Ali Abunimah, who's the co-founder of the Electronic Intifada. Jackie Walker, who's a former chair of Momentum and an anti-racism trainer and writer. And Ben Norton, who's the assistant editor of the Grey Zone. So welcome to all our speakers this evening. Sure you'll agree we have an excellent panel, well versed in the attacks on free speech and well capable, I think, of giving a view as to, as I say, how we arrived at this present parlous situation and what do we do to take the campaign for free speech forward. I want to start, though, this evening, first of all, with Tony Greenstein, who will set the scene and give his thoughts for about 5 or 10 minutes. So over to you, Tony.
Thank you, comrades. I hope everyone can hear me. And a big welcome to everyone who's here, including, no doubt, whoever is reporting for the Jewish Chronicle and the Jewish News and other Zionist groups. I think we are blessed with opponents whose integrity and transparency is beyond question. I happen to be bringing a libel action against the campaign against anti-Semitism, which is probably better known for, to say, its integrity and honesty and straight dealing. And I wish to congratulate the campaign against anti-Semitism because out of all the organisations, it has managed to produce findings in its anti-Semitism barometer of 2019, which contradict every other finding to date about anti-Semitism. Most organisations, most polling organisations, most sociology and social studies organisations find that anti-Semitism, that is hatred or hostility to Jews, is more prevalent on the right than on the left. But the campaign against anti-Semitism has managed to come up with contrary results. It now finds that anti-Semitism on the far left in its 2019 barometer study is more prevalent on the far left than on the far right. And how did it achieve this magnificent task? Quite simply, it changed the questions, or rather it added the questions. Before, it had a series of 5 questions, statements which apparently would indicate whether or not you're anti-Semitic. Things, I presume, like Jews are good at business, Jews don't like sharing their money, and so on. But the campaign against anti-Semitism added 5, in fact, it was going to be 6 new statements to see whether you're anti-Semitic. And if I can briefly run them off, it is 1, Israel and its supporters are a bad influence on our democracy. If you believe that, then you're anti-Semitic. 2, Israel treats the Palestinians like the Nazis treated the Jews. Again, that is anti-Semitic. Number 3, Israel can get away with anything because its supporters control the media. Note, Israel's supporters, not Jews. Nonetheless, that's anti-Semitic. Number 4, I am comfortable spending time with people who openly support Israel. And if you're not comfortable spending time with such people, I'm afraid you're anti-Semitic. Imagine someone had asked that question of, I am comfortable or not comfortable spending time with people who support apartheid in South Africa. Would that make you a racist against white people? I leave it to you to judge. But in the case of Israel, that is anti-Semitic. 5, Israel makes a positive contribution to the world. Even the tame academics who backed this study, Dr. Allington at King's College London and the notorious David Hirsch of Goldsmith College, couldn't stomach this one being an anti-Semitic. In other words, even if you don't believe Israel makes a positive contribution, that doesn't necessarily make you anti-Semitic. However, the campaign against anti-Semitism tells us that it's a very good predictor of people who are anti-Semitic. And lastly, of course, Israel has a right to defend itself against those who want to destroy it. So if you don't accept that, or you don't accept the terms of that debate, you're an anti-Semite. So you can see what the culmination of the process, which started off with the redefinition of anti-Semitism via the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, is. And of course, the campaign against anti-Semitism, which is the foremost organization leading the charge against free speech on Palestine. It was one of the 2 organizations which reported the Labour Party to the Equality and Human Rights Commission. You can see how it has taken this campaign forward. And it has its own definition of anti-Semitism, which is a cut-down version of the IHRA, because the IHRA, bad as it is, at least has a few paragraphs as a preamble to its 11 illustrations of anti-Semitism, saying that whether they are anti-Semitic depends on the context of the statement, and they could be or may be anti-Semitic. But as far as the campaign against anti-Semitism is concerned, all the statements, all the illustrations of anti-Semitism in the IHRA definition are anti-Semitic, full stop. One of them is, if you compare Zionism or Israel in any way to the Nazis, that is anti-Semitic. So I've been doing some research over the past few years about the relationship of Zionism to Hitler and the Nazis. I made a statement at the Palestine Expo organization, its festival last year. I said that Israel was the bastard offspring of Hitler, or of Nazi Germany, which was prominently reported in the Jewish Chronicle for reasons beyond my comprehension. But I wanted to give some other examples and to lay the basis that Zionism historically has never had any objection to anti-Semitism. On the contrary, it's always sought to ally with it and make use of it, because nothing Zionism hates more than the fact that Jews live in the diaspora outside Israel. And it came to share many of the same assumptions of the anti-Semites themselves about the asocial nature of Jews who are divorced from what they consider their rightful homeland, and being guests, as they put it, in other people's countries has made Jews, that was a historical view of Zionism, had made Jews asocial, not very welcoming, more of them to become businessmen and exploiters and workers and so on. So this was the historical view of Zionism towards anti-Semitism, that it was in many ways a force for good. And the question is, what was its attitude when the Nazis came to power? And the answer is quite simple. It saw the Nazis in exactly the same way as it had seen anti-Semitism traditionally. Whereas the vast majority of Jews reacted with horror to the rise of Hitler, the Nazis saw it as a golden opportunity to build their state. And I just want to quote, if I have a few quotes, which I want to read out to give you some indication of this. First of all, from Ben Gurion, the biography, the official biography by Shabtai Teveth. It's a final chapter of his book, The Burning Ground. And I do recommend people read it, where he says, the harsher the affliction, the greater the strength of Zionism. In other words, he wasn't at all put out by the rise of Hitler. Whereas the vast majority of Jews reacted with horror and they immediately launched an unofficial boycott of Nazi Germany, the Zionists went full steam ahead in campaigning against any such boycott. They wanted to work with the regime. And Ben Gurion himself is famous for his statements in December 1938, after Kristallnacht, when the British agreed to the Kinder transport, which brought 10,000 Jewish children over from Nazi Germany and Czechoslovakia, which of course had been invaded by then. Ben Gurion said, if I knew that it would be possible to save all the children in Germany by bringing them over to England, and only half of them by transporting them to Eretz Israel, then I would opt for the second alternative, for we must weigh not only the life of these children, but also the history of the people of Israel. That statement was made to the Central Committee of Mapai, the Israeli Labour Party. And Ben Gurion's biographer, Shabtai Teveth, who in many ways is a hagiographer, said in the final chapter of the biography, page 851, The Burning Ground, if there was a line in Ben Gurion's mind between the beneficial disaster and an all-destroying catastrophe, it must have been a very thin one. And Ben Gurion is also quoted as saying in the same chapter by Teveth, where there was a conflict of interest between saving individual Jews and the good of the Zionist enterprise, we shall say that the enterprise comes first. So this is Ben Gurion, who was the first prime minister of Israel. He was a chairman of the Jewish Agency and the Jewish Agency executive. But let me give you some other examples, because it's not just Ben Gurion. The Zionist poet, national poet, Chaim Nachman Bialik, he was of the opinion that Hitler has perhaps saved German Jewry. Why? Because it was being assimilated into annihilation. And you can make of that what you will. I came across a PhD by a person called Etan Bloom, a PhD thesis at Tel Aviv University. And you can look it up, it's on the internet. And he wrote about Chaim Weizmann, who was the first president of Israel, someone who worked very closely with Arthur Rupin, who was maybe the most important person in Palestine before the establishment of the State of Israel itself. He was chair of the Palestine office from 1908, and he was in charge of the nuts and bolts of settlement. He was called the father of land settlement. He wrote a book called The Sociology of Jews, and Louis Namier, who was the personal secretary to Chaim Weizmann, had written the introduction. And Weizmann, who worked closely with Rupin, read Namier's introduction and had to warn him. And I quote, not to be so open in expressing their common toleration of Nazism, because, quote, the louts, presumably anti-Zionists, will say the Jews themselves think that it will be all for the good. Bloom commented that Rupin's attitude to the Nazis then reflects the general reaction of many Zionists, including liberals, inverted quotes, like Weizmann. Pinchas, another example of anti-Semitism and genuine anti-Semitism, was Israel's first justice minister, and actually a liberal justice minister at that, Pinchas Rosenblatt, who described Palestine as an institute for the fumigation of Jewish vermin. Decide for yourself whether you would think that was anti-Semitic if it was made in any other context whatsoever. The PhD thesis, incidentally, for those who are interested, is by Etan Bloom, E-T-A-N, Arthur Rupin, and the Production of the Modern Hebrew Culture. So it was a thesis at Tel Aviv University. And someone who's written about it, and from a Zionist point of view, Francis Nicosia, who is the Raoul Hilberg Professor of Holocaust Studies at Vermont University, he spoke in his book, The Third Zionism and Nazism, Zionism and Anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany. He spoke of the illusory assumption of German Zionism that Zionism must have been well served by a Nazi victory, given their lack of support amongst German Jewry. Hitler's victory could only bolster Zionist fortunes. And I'll give you just a few other examples. Burl Katznelson, who was really the deputy to Ben-Gurion and editor of Davar, their paper, saw the rise of Hitler as, quote, an opportunity to build and flourish like none we have ever had or ever will have. And again, that is in Nicosia's book, Zionism and Anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany. Ben-Gurion himself was more optimistic. He said the Nazis' victory would become a fertile force for Zionism. And the chairman of the German Zionist Federation, Rabbi Joachim Prinz, admitted that it was morally disturbing to be seen to be considered as the favorite children of the Nazi government, particularly when it dissolved the anti-Zionist youth groups and seemed in other ways to prefer the Zionists. The Nazis asked for a more Zionist behavior, and this was not surprising, because the Zionists formed at best 2 or 3% of the total of German Jewry, a fact which is often forgotten today. Bloom quotes Emil Ludwig, who was a world-famous biographer, who expressed the general attitude of the Zionist movement, which was, quote, Hitler will be forgotten in a few years, but he will have a beautiful monument in Palestine. You know, the coming of the Nazis was rather a welcome thing. So many of our German Jews were caught in the treacherous current between the Scylla of assimilation and Charybdis of a nodding acquaintance with Jewish things. Thousands who seemed to be completely lost to Judaism were brought back to the fold by Hitler. And for that, I am personally very grateful to him. I give you these examples because one of the illustrations, as I said, of the IHRA is that you shouldn't compare Israel or Zionism with Nazi Germany. And although some people make a very simplistic comparison and say Israel is like Nazi Germany, which is not the case, extermination isn't yet on the map of Zionism, there are obviously many, many similarities. For example, when Israeli mobs chant, as they often do, death to the Arabs, how is that different from the chant that was heard in Poland and Germany pre-war? Death to the Jews. There are many, many, other examples of similarities. But this is just one example of the IHRA. I picked it out because in many ways it's the most contentious. When Jeremy Corbyn said that he could support the IHRA, but for one half of the examples.
Tony, we probably need to wind it up now, mate. We've gone over time. I'm sorry.
Yes, thank you.
No, thanks very much indeed for that. That's a fascinating insight, Tony. And many of the things that you have outlined there, I mean, factual, historical points, of course, get you into difficulty these days in the Labour Party and in the wider media. It seems now people are persecuted, certainly demonized for expressing the truth. We saw that with, for example, Ken Livingstone, who was, eventually he's decided to resign from the Labour Party, but was initially suspended for referencing the Havara agreement. But look, when I took my case against the Labour Party last year in the High Court and won and secured costs from the party, I always said all along that when we took that case that if we were to be successful and win costs, that I would use those costs to establish a left legal fighting fund, which has now been created, and we have been helping quite a number of people already, and we continue to do so. Obviously, we need to raise funds for that on an ongoing basis, but it is an important weapon, if you like, in the battle for free speech, certainly as a useful way of defending people who have been unfairly traduced by the Labour Party and the Board of Deputies and a range of others who are seeking to get the truth out there and speak up predominantly for the Palestinian people. But of course, free speech isn't just simply about speaking out on Palestine, important though that is, as I've already said in my opening remarks. People like Julian Assange are currently being persecuted for the temerity of exposing war crimes by the United States of America, and is facing a potential prison sentence, if they're successful in extraditing him, of 175 years, essentially, obviously, the rest of his life. And it's really important, therefore, that we get behind that campaign as well. But let me bring in our next speaker now, who is Jackie Walker, one of the people, along with Marc Wadsworth and Tony and myself, who helped to start this campaign on free speech. Jackie was one of the earlier victims of the witch hunt, and indeed, when I lent my support to Jackie, that was then used against me. And one of the accusations that was levelled by the Labour Party's bureaucrats as evidence of me, as they put it in their words, Jew baiting, which is an absolutely despicable thing to say, was the fact that I'd had the temerity to book a room in the House of Commons to show a film that was about the attacks on anti-Zionist Jews, and it focused a lot on Jackie Walker. Interestingly, I'd been asked to book the room by Jewish members of the Labour Party to show a film about predominantly Jewish members of the party, and for that, and I believe that all the participants, or nearly all the participants in the film, were also themselves Jewish, and for that I was attacked and traduced and demonized as some sort of anti-Semite for having the temerity to book a room to show that film. If you've not seen it, it is an excellent documentary, well worth viewing, and you can see it now, I believe, free of charge by logging on to YouTube and searching Witch Hunt film, Jackie Walker, and I think you should find it. And if you've not seen it, I would highly recommend it to you. But with that said, can I just give the floor now to Jackie and let Jackie speak for the next 5 or 10 minutes about her thoughts on this issue?
I mean, like you said, I mean, I'd really like to take this on and be a bit more sort of general in terms of what's happening to free speech at the moment. But I must just catch something that Chris said, because actually what happened then was that the Board of Deputies decided to name me and Ken Livingstone specifically, and really name us to make us banned people. Now, there's only really one contemporary regime that I know has managed to do that. And of course, that was in South Africa, where people actually did become banned people. So this is really about the freedom to express yourself. I want to think about how this has actually happened. And one thing, and one way I think it has happened, is through the inversion of identity politics. So here we are as the left, as anti-racist. We have worked for years to get the terminology of equalities accepted and acceptable. And actually what's happened is that this has been inverted so that we see, for example, people like Trump talking about a witch hunt and freedom of speech and fake news. And we also see Zionists doing this, talking about Zionism being simply the liberation of Jewish people, without actually mentioning that that liberation is at the cost to Palestinian people. And so it's extraordinary how this has worked. And then we see that in the Labour Party, the way this has come, through a real suppression of freedom of speech. And one thing I'll remind people is this didn't actually start with Keir Starmer. This happened and started under Jeremy Corbyn for lots of different reasons. And of course, the pressure that he was under was huge. And what we've seen now is the stepping up of that by Keir Starmer. And we have seen him go through the charade of a so-called conference where there were no votes and no speeches, and there was no reason why that wouldn't be true, where CLPs have actually been virtually forbidden from discussing and mentioning my name, where people are forbidden to discuss whether they're suspended or not. They have been totally forbidden to speak about the leaked report, and this is all without any ruling having gone through conference or any of the democratic processes. Because, of course, what is now become profoundly true is that the watchdog that would usually guard our rights, who are the people like the HRC, like the media, have themselves become not just corrupted, but co-opted by the establishment. That process this week took a huge surge ahead when we saw the new appointments for the BBC and the regulation of people who work for the BBC in terms of what they might tweet out on pain of being sacked. We already have, according to academic research, the most right-wing media newspapers in the whole of Europe. That's going to be, of course, increased by the new, is it called GBL? News station that's going to come up, where I hear Nigel Farage is going to be a key presenter. So here we have this topsy-turvy world where socialists and anti-racists have been pilloried for being racist, where freedom of speech is apparently only free if you follow a particular political and ideological line. Where this week, for example, we've also seen the education system now being censored so that you can't use material that critiques capitalism. So we're now at an extremely dangerous point in terms of freedom of speech. This is not just about Palestine. This is not just about race. This has now become, if you like, about the salvation of the world. And I say that with no feeling that I'm exaggerating. Because when you have a country dominated by a Murdoch press, which is a press that actually doesn't really believe in global warming, when you have so few years to actually in any way mitigate the effects of that, then what we're into is not just about the survival of one people over another. We're actually talking about the survival of humankind. And so I think we need to be taking these limitations on our freedom of speech very seriously. And just one more case in point. This week, I don't know how many of you noticed, Ai Weiwei went to Julian Assange's trial. And it wasn't mentioned in any way. I don't know how many of you saw that, because of course it wasn't reported by the media. What's interesting is if your name is Pussy Riot and you're speaking out against Putin, or you're Ai Weiwei and you're speaking out against the Chinese regime, you will be reported. But anybody who dares question the increasingly authoritarian stance of our media and our so-called leaders, you will not be reported in this country. And this is something that is of critical importance. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Jackie. That was a really useful insight and taking a wider perspective, which I think is really useful and important in this discussion. I want to now bring in Marc Wadsworth, if I can. Marc described himself as a citizen journalist, amongst other things, but Marc, back in the day, worked on the Daily Mirror, so has experience of working in the mainstream media. And I think, Marc, you'd probably agree, I don't know if you want to touch on this in your contribution, that we have anything but a pluralist press in this country, or indeed a media across the piece, really, falls down badly in terms of showing or giving opportunities to different voices and different perspectives. We get a very one-dimensional view of the world, it seems to me, and there is no real alternative. I mean, I think the Daily Mirror isn't what it once was, but I don't know whether you would agree with that. But maybe you could perhaps in your remarks, perhaps just touch on that briefly and then get into the main body of what you were going to say this evening. So over to you, Marc.
Thank you very much. And it's an absolute pleasure to be on this broadcast on the first day of Black History Month in Britain. And I have to say that Tony Greenstein is an undoubted scholar. And it was important for us to listen to examples of his scholarship. But I don't always agree with everything that Tony says. He's polemical and unashamedly so, and uncompromising in what he says. I think that Black History Month should be all year, whether it be in the United States or the UK. It shouldn't just be consigned to 1 month, because there's so much to celebrate. The achievements of Black people throughout the globe. It shouldn't just be confined to 2 continents. Needs to be shouted from on high. And I'm celebrating Black History Month here in London with a new book, Comrade Sack, which is being launched on Mahatma Gandhi's birthday, his 151st birthday, tomorrow. And the book is about an Indian communist, Shapoorji Saklatvala, who represented the South London seat of North Battersea in 1922. He was the first Indian Labour MP. He was always a communist. Up until 1924, you could be both a Labour Party member and a Communist Party member. Nothing wrong with that. Under the Labour Party's 1918 Federalist Constitution, which found a place for the Fabians, the Cooperative Party. They're still affiliated, as are the trade unions and the socialist societies. But the communists have been witch hunted and excluded since 1924. Shapoorji Saklatvala stood for the anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, pro-Indian independence, pro-Irish independence, the independence of Palestine after the 1917 Balfour Declaration, and liberation throughout the globe, and the promotion of socialism, internationalism, world peace, and justice. And I have to say that my best friend is Palestinian. His father, after the Balfour Declaration, was born in Palestine, which, as viewers may know, was a British mandate, in other words, a colony. He was born in Israel and exiled from their land in Jaffa. And some of us will remember that Jaffa was a place where our oranges came from, citrus fruit. There were still Jaffa cakes, a biscuit. And my friend grew up in Jordan, and Cyprus, with his land, the family land, confiscated under settler colonialism, which is a stain on the world and needs to be opposed in the same way as we opposed apartheid in racist South Africa. Desmond Tutu has said that. Nelson Mandela has said that. So I'm not saying anything particularly controversial. We must stand side by the Palestinians in the way that Jeremy Corbyn, the most radical left-wing leader the Labour Party has ever seen since its inception, its foundation in 1900, was a lifelong supporter of that cause. But I'm sorry to say that as he thought that he was going to get into number 10, he sacrificed some of that outspoken commitment. He went silent on the issue. He threw his friends and allies like Chris Williamson, Ken Livingstone, Jackie Walker, and myself under a bus in a desperate and vain attempt to gain power. But what's power without principle? It's very important to stick to principle, and socialism is nothing without solidarity. Let me ask the question, what do we mean by black? In the US, it means African American. In Britain, since the 1970s, we've had political black that embraces African, Caribbean, and Asians. In fact, all people who face discrimination, racism, because of the color of our skin. I was asked at the book launch of my original volume, that was in 1998, about Indian communist Shapoorji Sakdawala, why did you write about that Paki? And that was by an African Caribbean. And I'd like to think such intercommunal chauvinism no longer exists 22 years later, but sadly it does. We need all black people united to fight racism through self-organization, self-determination, and the leadership of the anti-racist struggle. And sometimes we see with the white left that they want to colonize us through things like Stand Up to Racism, the Socialist Workers' Party's front, the Anti-Nazi League, which did good work fighting the Nazis, but it didn't have black people in the leadership, nor to stand up to racism. And our white comrades, yes, they are welcome on board as genuine allies. We need them. We can't win without them. But nothing about us without us. We must be integral to the fight back, to fight white privilege and the white supremacy Donald Trump has shown he supports with his backing in the debate last night with Joe Biden for racist groups like the Proud Boys. Here in the UK, we've had the toxic xenophobic Brexit debate, you know, exiting Europe. Grenfell, that fire, that massacre of 72 human beings who were mainly migrants, asylum seekers, Muslims, black people, but predominantly poor, in a tower block where they lived, which was basically just an incendiary building. The town hall, Kensington and Chelsea, the richest borough council in the country, didn't care, burnt. And I'm surprised that the people responsible are not behind bars. They spent more time, the authorities, chasing people for making claims for compensation that they say were fraudulent. And then we have Windrush, a ship that my father came over after he served in the Second World War from 1944 as an RAF volunteer. The Windrush scandal, a generation of Caribbean people thrown on the scrap heap by Theresa May's government and with her hostile environment policy. And that still hasn't been resolved in terms of compensation for people who were refused a passport, expelled from Britain, sent to Caribbean islands where they died, denied medical help and support. And the COVID crisis, where people of African Caribbean descent, Asian descent, are disproportionately represented among those who have been affected and those who have died. There's a statistic of 95% of doctors who died in the first phase from March onwards were from African Caribbean, of African Caribbean and Asian descent. And I'm proud that an organization that I helped to found, Grassroots Black Left, has put out a position paper, a widely well-received position paper on this scandal. And I can make that available to people who are watching today. We can get that distributed. I was expelled from the Labour Party in April 2018. I won't go into details about that, but it was based on a bogus allegation of anti-Semitism. But basically, it was as a supporter, a staunch black supporter of Jeremy Corbyn. I was collateral damage in a catastrophic, for the socialist left, faction fight. The right wing of Blair-like new leader Keir Starmer won. This is the man that dismissed Black Lives Matter. That militancy, that energy, that vibrancy of worldwide demonstrations sparked by the murder of George Floyd, an unarmed black man, by a police officer, a white police officer in America. He dismissed it as just a moment and not a movement. And I think there's reason for optimism. Black Lives Matter, Extension Rebellion, Occupy, strikes in workplaces, a new, young and militant extra-parliamentary insurgency in Britain, the US and throughout the world. It's exciting, morale boosting, and gives us great hope for what is possible today and in the future. And that's what Shapoorji Saklatvala died for. And Chris, on your point, final point about the bias of the media, have a look in my book, because it reports Greg Philo's report about bad news for Labour and the anti-Semitism case. It quotes the Media Reform Coalition report, where I am a case study in the way that the media was biased against me, not even calling me up for my side of the story. You've suffered from that. Jackie suffered from that. Ken Livingston suffered from that. Fake news that actually disgraces professional journalism. And I think that we should be bolstered by the knowledge that journalism is just the first draft of history. It's not the final version. And in the future, when the historians look back on the injustices that we face, the miscarriages of justice that we face, we will be vindicated. Aluta continua.
Thanks very much indeed, Mark, as inspirational as always. And it's really important, I think, the point that you make about maintaining hope. And I'm reminded of your doppelganger, Jesse Jackson, when he addressed the 1988 Democratic Convention and made it very clear in his speech. He repeated time and again that keep hope alive. And it really falls upon us, I think, to do that. And there is a lot to be optimistic about. You're absolutely right. I mean, we're seeing these movements emerging in this country and around the world that you mentioned. And, as we go forward, I think it's important that we try and build those links internationally with the liberation struggles and progressive movements in every nation around the world. And it's so important, I think, that we recognize the strength, really, the collective strength of standing together, not just with people in this country, but with comrades overseas as well. And I was also interested with your comments about apartheid and the comparison of the despicable regime that is inflicting such horrors on the Palestinian people. And, I think back to the campaign for, or against, should I say, against the apartheid regime of South Africa, and how ludicrous it would have been if there was a Friends of South Africa in Parliament, as we have at the moment, Labour Friends of Israel, Conservative Friends of Israel, who rail against any criticism of the Israeli state. I mean, no two ways about it. It is an appalling apartheid regime there. And indeed, I've spoken to people from South Africa who lived through the apartheid regime there, and they've been to Palestine, and they say that the situation in Palestine is even worse than the terrible apartheid that they were subjected to for all those years in South Africa itself. Now, I'm not sure if we've got Ben Norton back with us, but if he is, could we put him up on the screen before I introduce him? If not, I'll. Are you there, Ben? Yes, great. I'm delighted. We lost you for a moment, Ben. I wasn't sure if we'd managed to get you back. Yeah, I'm really pleased to have Ben with us this evening. Ben, as I said in the opening remarks, is the deputy editor of the Grey Zone, and Ben, you did a really interesting piece the other day about the exposure of some leaked documents related to a massive Syria propaganda campaign that was waged by Western government contractors, and one of which I understand was the Integrity Initiative, a body based in this country, part of the Institute for Statecraft. A body that I sought to shed some light on when I was a member of Parliament, and some people suggest that my questions about the Integrity Initiative coincided with the intensification of the attacks against me. Whether there's any connection, I don't know. I'm not making that connection myself, but certainly the work that you and the Grey Zone do is so important, particularly given the paucity of pluralist voices in the corporate media. So anybody who's unfamiliar with the Grey Zone, I would highly recommend that you log into their publications, and Ben might say a little bit about the work they do, but if you just Google them and go onto your search engine, you should be able to find the Grey Zone. Do some excellent work on a range of different topics, and always well worth a read. So over to you, Ben, and thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening.
Thank you for the kind words, Chris. It means a lot. And thank you for the invitation. I think that's actually a really good introduction to the remarks I wanted to make, looking at this massive propaganda campaign that was overseen by Western governments and a variety of contractors. By the way, that report that I published was based on leaked documents from the British Foreign Office, and the authenticity of those documents has now been confirmed by the British government. It claimed that they were hacked in an alleged cyber attack. Now, they presented no evidence of a cyber attack, but they did confirm that these documents are real. And it shows how there is a variety of contractors, including a contractor called ARK, a contractor called IncoStrat, the Adam Smith International, which is pretty well known for working closely with the British government. It's basically a British intelligence cutout. And many of these firms also were working with other Western governments. The firm ARK also had contracts with the US government, the Dutch government, the UN, the European Union. And we see this massive industrial level, just enormous international propaganda campaign. And I think what's interesting about that is it's a juxtaposition to a simultaneous campaign that is meant at censoring people who have called out that propaganda, who have exposed that propaganda. So we see a very concerted campaign to censor voices on social media, to block websites that provide an independent perspective that is not provided ever in mainstream Western corporate media. And I don't think it's a coincidence that these two things are happening simultaneously, that there's a massive propaganda campaign that essentially amounts to industrial scale brainwashing of Western taxpayers, people who are effectively subsidizing their own psychological operations that are being waged against them. I mean, it's pretty scandalous. And in the scandal that I showed in my article, we should keep in mind that this is not just is targeted at people in the Middle East, although that doesn't downplay the severity of targeting the Middle East. There shouldn't be propaganda campaigns targeting people in Syria and its neighbors. But it's even more scandalous that those same propaganda campaigns also continued in the so-called West, inside the UK, where British taxpayers effectively subsidized their own propaganda brainwashing operations, and then in the US as well. Those documents that I reported on show that these firms were boasting that they had contacts with and were successfully placed stories in the New York Times, the Guardian, the Washington Post, CNN, UK's Channel 4, the BBC, BuzzFeed. All of the top major Western corporate media outlets were affected by this. And at the same time, we have seen that more and more voices that oppose the war in Syria, oppose the war in Yemen, oppose the regime change efforts targeting Venezuela, targeting China, targeting Russia, targeting Nicaragua, and anyone who speaks out against any of these imperialist crimes that are going on right now, there's a very real possibility that they'll be censored. We saw Venezuela Analysis, which is a major independent website in the U.S. that focuses, based in the U.S., with many of its reporters in Venezuela, although they're U.S. nationals for the most part, who are reporting on Venezuela, totally independent. They had their Twitter account suspended, and then after a backlash in a publicity campaign, Twitter agreed to restore their profile. But we've seen it happen to many other people, and especially targeting foreign media outlets. There's been massive censorship. And we have to understand that this censorship is not just done by Twitter and Facebook because they want to do it because they're just sitting around thinking who they can censor. No, it's initiated by the U.S. government and the British government and other Western governments. We know this very clearly. In the case of our reporting at the Gray Zone, we've shown that the FBI, for instance, initiated a purge of alternative media outlets on Facebook and Twitter. And of course, I should stress that Facebook owns Instagram and also WhatsApp, the most popular messaging app in the world. And of course, YouTube is owned by Google. All of these platforms are, well, Facebook and Google, that is to say, are contractors with the US government. Google, for instance, has contracts with the CIA. Google has contracts with the U.S. military. Google helps support the U.S. military occupation forces in Iraq. Google has contracts with U.S. police forces across the country that help them surveil activists, including right now, while Google pretends to support Black Lives Matter, it's actually supporting the surveillance state that is suppressing Black Lives Matter activists and spying on them and violating their civil liberties. In the case of Facebook, we know that Facebook works very closely with the U.S. government and especially has links to the Atlantic Council, which is funded by the U.S. government and by NATO and is used, ironically, in this kind of circular censorship strategy. The Atlantic Council, which is funded by Facebook and the U.S. government and the British government and NATO, is used by Facebook as a supposed independent fact checker in order to censor websites that criticize U.S., British, and NATO policy. So you can just see these networks, they're quite clear. And I was saying that the FBI initiated this purge targeting alternative media, and there are websites like the American Herald Tribune, which they claim was supposedly an Iranian op. Now, most recently, the FBI and the NSA initiated a very dubious campaign, speciously trying to link this website no one had ever heard of called Peace Data, which had 197 likes on Facebook. So it virtually didn't exist in terms of actually reaching readers, reaching viewers. It virtually didn't exist. But the FBI claimed without any evidence that it was a Russian cyber operation to help Trump win by posting left-wing content criticizing Joe Biden and Keir Starmer. And there was no evidence of that presented whatsoever. But immediately in response to that, Facebook and Twitter agreed under FBI pressure to not only block that page, which didn't have any impact because that page, like I said, didn't have any actual following, but also that was clearly part of an operation led by the FBI to target other media outlets whose content was reposted by Peace Data, who are those outlets? They include the Gray Zone, they include Mint Press News, they include Common Dreams, they include the Worldwide Socialist website. So basically the only websites that exist that remain, the Canary and a few others, but there are very few websites out there right now in English that are providing a perspective criticizing Western imperialism. And it's just a coincidence, I guess, that the FBI initiated campaign to censor this so-called Russian website included a list of all those websites as being complicit in a supposed Russian disinformation operation. So clearly, the reason I mention all of these details is not the minor details are important for us reporters, but for average activists and in people who are concerned about free speech and other issues, the minor issues are, I think, missing the forest for the trees. The forest that I'm getting at here is that there's very clearly a concerted campaign being led by Western intelligence agencies, not just the FBI. It's clear that British intelligence agencies and the British military are involved. I'll get to that in a moment, to censor alternative media outlets and individual voices on social media platforms. And we've seen many layers of purges, many levels of purges targeting Venezuelans, Syrians. We've seen a horrific censorship campaign targeting Yemenis, Iranians, Palestinians. And now that, at first, a lot of great Western liberals who don't care about the global South and talk about how great their supposed democracies are, they weren't concerned. But now that it's actually come back at home, some people are finally recognizing the real threat of what is effectively state-mandated censorship. And the censorship narrative in the U.S., I think, is very cultural. It's oriented around the culture war, as with everything in U.S. politics, mainstream bourgeois U.S. politics. So it's about what Trump said and the Republicans and the Democrats and using certain language and all of that. And I'm not saying that language is unimportant. Of course, people should be using language that respects people, but that's not the main threat to freedom of speech. The right wingers in the U.S. would like us to believe that PC culture, the politically correct liberals, are threatening free speech. No. The real threat to free speech is being directed top down by the state through Silicon Valley contractors. And I say contractors because these social media corporations are not independent companies that have no links to the U.S. government. As I said earlier, they have contracts with many different U.S. government and other Western government agencies. And we see it very clearly that there's this concerted effort being led to censor alternative voices on these platforms and use a variety of excuses. Now, the censorship targeting Palestinians and people who support Palestinian liberation and oppose Israeli apartheid and colonialism, that's a very effective strategy. And it works because, one, pro-Israel groups have a lot of resources and money behind them. But also, I think it's actually even more insidious. The reason it's so effective is because they can weaponize anti-Semitism, as Tony was discussing and the other guests were discussing. So in that sense, the censorship of pro-Palestinian voices it's disguised as, in this liberal Zionist, ridiculous propaganda campaign, as pushing back against racism and silencing racists on our platforms. It's cynical. It's totally false. They're the real racists who are censoring anti-racists. But there's a certain logic to that narrative. But I think we should also understand that censorship campaign as part of a larger censorship campaign, and that is the kind of beginning of a larger imperial censorship campaign targeting anti-imperialists. We saw the Chow Collective, which is a major Chinese-American collective that opposes the new Cold War on China and consists of leftists and anti-imperialists. They had their account suspended on both Twitter and Instagram. And then in response to a massive publicity campaign and people signed an open letter, they did agree to these companies agreed to restore their accounts. But it's clear that what they're doing is they're testing the waters. They're starting with lower level accounts to see who they can suspend and how much outrage there will be, and continuing to work up. And again, this is not empty speculation. There are so many examples of the FBI's hand, also the Mike Pompeo State Department's hand. The Mike Pompeo State Department just published an article just a few weeks ago, a report rather, listing so-called Russian disinformation websites. And it listed several websites, including Global Research, Global Research is a Canadian website run by this guy, Michel Chodorowski. I don't really know much about him, but what is clear is that he is not in any way working for the Russian government. He is a Canadian national. And actually, the US State Department report didn't even try to link him directly to Russia, but they said that his website, Global Research, is dangerous, supposedly, because it's publishing information that helps support so-called Russian propaganda and Russian disinformation interests. And then in response to that, Global Research was Twitter and other social media platforms put up warning messages saying, don't read this link. So if you post a link now to Global Research, even though there's no evidence whatsoever linking it to Russia, but they're saying undesirable information. So if you now click to any link on this website on Twitter, you get a message saying you should not read this website. Then that was just one level of censorship in response to this U.S. State Department report. After Pompeo published this report, some of the other websites listed, who are probably more actually linked to Russia, they were completely blocked on Twitter and Facebook. So, and we've seen something similar with Press TV, which is an Iranian state-backed media outlet that it actually has had its YouTube account deleted 6 times. 6 times. Telesur, which is backed by several Latin American governments, provides a leftist anti-imperialist perspective, has had its platforms suspended in social media several times. So there's so many examples of this. I mean, I just provide a lot of context and evidence because I don't want people, frequently people try to discount your claims saying it's a stupid conspiracy theory, there's no evidence. No, there's mountains and mountains of evidence. And you can see the hand of the US government clearly shaping this. And I should stress, this is a bipartisan campaign. Many of the neoconservatives who support Joe Biden and who would be overseeing his foreign policy, they are totally on board with this censorship campaign. So finally, I'm just going to conclude by saying that we need to understand the provenance of this censorship campaign. We need to understand the political orientation, why it's happening, and understand that it's part of this larger new Cold War. The U.S. Department of Defense, the Pentagon, published a report over 2 years ago now. It was the first national defense strategy for the United States in a decade, since 9/11. And it was important because it's a marked shift from the so-called war on terror rhetoric. So after 9/11, so up until 1991, you have the first Cold War, and then this era of U.S. unipolar hegemonic domination, and then 9/11, and you have the so-called war on terror. We all know here that was totally bogus. It actually spread terror around the world, and the U.S. supported al-Qaeda in numerous countries, and is still supporting al-Qaeda in Syria and Yemen and other countries. So it's totally ridiculous and a total farce, just marketing to justify the U.S. expanding its military operations around the globe. But I think that we can say pretty conclusively that the war on terror, it's not totally over, but that paradigm has shifted, and we're now in a new paradigm of the new Cold War. Mike Pompeo gave a State Department a few months ago in the Richard Nixon Library, essentially declaring a new Cold War on China, saying that there's a new coalition of Western so-called democracies that are committed to overthrowing the Chinese government. He said the Communist Party of China, but the Communist Party of China is the party that runs the government. So he explicitly said they want to overthrow the Chinese government, and they're working to do everything they can to do that. The U.S. military is doing military exercises right now, and the U.S. Air Force published photos showing that their soldiers have patches, and the patches show a Predator drone over a red silhouette of China, as if they're bombing China, and they were doing a simulated invasion of an island near the South China Sea. So there's so many examples of this here. And as part of the new Cold War, you have to also manufacture consent for this new Cold War. And the way you do that is through control of media narratives. And it's very clear that the US government and other Western European governments are very concerned that they've lost control of these media narratives because Western corporate media outlets they've just completely lost the faith of their own citizenry because they've just printed so many lies again and again, lie after lie, to justify Western wars of aggression. I mentioned the role of British intelligence services in the British military. There are many examples, but I think we should definitely point out that Twitter, the head of Middle East editing, the editorial director for Middle East content on Twitter, is a member of the 77th Brigade of the British Army, which is the British Psychological Operations Unit, the Information Warfare Unit. And he is also, well, he's simultaneously a British information warfare soldier. He's also a senior executive at Twitter. And there are other examples. So the point I'm saying is going forward is that we should be really concerned about not just pro-Palestinian voices, but anyone speaking out against the regime change efforts against Iran and Venezuela, anyone who opposes the war in Yemen, and most importantly, anyone who's speaking out against this ridiculous, pointless, needless new Cold War on Russia and China. There's a very real threat that we can all be censored, not because we're publishing incorrect information, but actually because we're publishing factual information that exposes the crimes of Western imperialism and will be falsely smeared as Russian or Chinese disinformation. So thank you for giving me this platform in this discussion, and I look forward to hearing what Ali Abunimah and others have to say. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Ben. That was a really fascinating contribution, and keep doing what you're doing. More power to your elbow, Ben, and to the rest of your colleagues at the Grey Zone. You know, they say that there's nothing new under the sun, and I remember reading about the Operation Mockingbird that was exposed by the Church Committee in 1975, where the CIA got tame journalists, as it were, to place stories to support the administration, to reinforce the Cold War, to undermine the burgeoning civil rights movement. And you know, it's just the same old thing, but more sophisticated now. So voices like we hear in the Grey Zone are really crucially important, because we're not hearing those voices, those aspects of the truth in the mainstream media. So keep going, Ben, and doing what you're doing. I was also particularly interested in your comments about Syria, because I mean that was one of the other issues that I was attacked about, because I questioned the evidence that was being used to justify the airstrikes on Syria. I think it was in 2018, and I was dismissed as a crank by colleagues in the House of Commons, and indeed by mainstream journalists. I remember getting having a very difficult interview on Channel 4 with Kathy Newman. She didn't call me a crank, but she certainly implied that. And this is the problem that we have, and obviously what you're doing also on Venezuela, another passion of mine. It is so important that you keep doing what you're doing, and you know, we get that narrative out there. So just to repeat the point, if you don't already follow the Grey Zone, please do after listening to Ben this evening. Our final speaker is Ali Abunimah, who is a co-founder, as I said, of the Electronic Intifada, a really, really important voice, particularly on Middle East issues and the Palestinian liberation struggle. One of the few platforms, you know, where you do get genuine free speech, and Electronic Intifada is regularly attacked by the usual suspects. So a big thank you, Ali, for taking the time out to join us this evening, and I'm sure our viewers are keen to hear what you have to say. So over to you, Ali.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. I feel like I know you all very well, because I've read about you and heard you for so many years, but I think it's probably the first time I've spoken to some of you. And I think Tony, when he wrote to invite me, I can't remember the exact words he used, but he described this as a collection of, you know, people who have all been exiled and damned for what they say. And I'm sorry if I'm misquoting you, Tony, but I'm very honored to be among this group of people. And you know, this week there's so much going on today that I haven't really had time to reflect on this before today. But this week marks the 20th anniversary of the start of the Second Intifada, the second uprising in the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip. And it's really hard for me to believe that 20 years have gone by like that. But I've been thinking back to that time. One thing is, it makes me realize how old I'm getting and how long I've been doing this kind of work. But when I think back to 20 years, I remember that we fought very, very hard always for access to media, to be able to challenge the Israeli propaganda and lies that were just everywhere and being used to dehumanize Palestinians and justify the mass slaughter that Israel was engaging in. I remember a statistic I used to cite all the time that was reported in Israeli media was that within the first few days of the uprising, before any Palestinian had fired a single shot, the Israeli army had fired more than 1 million bullets at Palestinians. Some of you will remember the indelible image of the young child, Mohammed Ad-Durra, hiding vainly behind his father from hails of Israeli bullets before he was killed. And I've seen on social media some people sharing those images again. But whereas we fought very hard for access, we would sometimes get it. So I remember back at that time, believe it or not, I could CNN to talk about what was happening in Palestine. I could get on MSNBC. I could even get on Fox. I was on Hannity and Combs at least once or twice. I could occasionally get on the BBC, on the CBC in Canada, and so on, and on public radio stations in the United States. But that was today. That's unthinkable. I mean, you don't see any kind of discussion of what's happening to Palestinians, and they said none of these channels would have me on. That was also the time 20 years ago when we were starting the Electronic Intifada as an alternative platform, originally to do media criticism. But then we realized, hang on a minute, this thing called the internet allows us to reach people directly without the censorship, without the gatekeeping that we're always fighting against. So why don't we just start doing our own reporting? And that's really how we began. We didn't start out saying we're going to, do reporting. We started off simply reacting, doing media criticism, correcting the media. And then we realized that we could actually start doing our own reporting. So the internet was a very liberating medium because it gave us the opportunity to reach people directly. You didn't need a multi-million-dollar printing plant to print newspapers. You didn't need a radio station with a tower. You didn't need a satellite to transmit. All you needed was, at that time, a rather bulky computer. But, you were in business. And I think the power of that, very quickly became apparent to anyone, to everyone, and most of all to our governments and the powers that be, who realized that the control that they asserted over people's thinking through the very limited media choices we had prior to the internet, they were losing that grip. Even prior to the internet, there was this sort of myth of a free press, a myth of a free media, but you really only had 3 or 4 channels. You really only had a few major newspapers, and although there might have been some debate in them, the range was very, very limited. And then along comes the internet and changes that. And Ben Norton laid out quite well, and so I won't repeat that, the kind of censorship that is now being exercised by corporations like Twitter, like Facebook, hand in glove with the governments, the Western governments, and of course the Israeli government. There are some really quite shocking examples of how extreme this censorship is becoming. Just last week, YouTube, Zoom, and Facebook all blocked an event at San Francisco State University featuring Layla Khaled, the Palestinian hijacker from the early, known, a resistance icon, but known for taking part in hijackings in the early 1970s. She herself was a child when she was expelled from her home and her country by Zionist militias in 1948, and she grew up to become a resistance fighter. And she never injured or killed anyone. Leila Khaled does not have anyone's blood on her hands, and yet Facebook, Twitter, and Zoom all blocked an event at a university. And I think it's important to just think about the significance of that these corporations can now decide what is taught in a classroom. We're all dependent on this technology because of the pandemic. We were already becoming dependent on it, but more so now. And the whole notion of academic freedom, where students can hear from whoever they want to, teachers can teach what they want to, it's a mockery when these companies can just unilaterally shut down an event and there's literally no way to hold it. So the censorship is becoming very extreme and very heavy-handed. Another example that we reported on at the Electronic Intifada just today, you would think that a medical journal like The Lancet, which is respected worldwide, the British journal The Lancet, would be immune to this kind of censorship and bullying and thuggery. But sadly, that's not the case. So we reported, my colleague Omar Karmi writes today about The Lancet removing, without explanation, without a reader's note, without even explaining to the authors, removing a letter that was published in March detailing the effects of Israeli military occupation and siege on healthcare in Gaza and how devastating these Israeli restrictions are in the context of the pandemic. So even The Lancet, which is supposedly a scientific journal with peer review, with independent editorial standards and so on, is subject to this kind of censorship. What I want to say, though, something else happened last week at the same time as the Leila Khaled censorship, sort of around the same time as the anniversary of the Second Intifada, and that was the decision by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is, of course, known as being one of the squad, one of the progressive members of Congress here in the United States, pulled out of a planned commemoration for the 25th anniversary of the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli prime minister. And she pulled out because of the uproar and the backlash, highlighting that Yitzhak Rabin was a war criminal for his entire adult life, starting in 1948, all the way through to the day of his death. He was a full participant in Israel's crimes. And what's significant about that is that for the past 25 years, there has been a relentless propaganda campaign whitewashing Yitzhak Rabin as a martyr for peace. And this campaign was promoted by governments every year. Governments, European diplomats attend commemorations for Rabin. He has been whitewashed as this martyr for peace. And what was really quite remarkable is that entire narrative collapsed in 24 hours when AOC, under pressure and at the urging of her supporters and Palestinians and supporters of Palestinian rights, pulled out. And that was unthinkable. I mean, that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. A few years ago, you would have been considered sort of a progressive hero for taking part in an event with the group that was sponsoring this memorial, Americans for Peace Now. It was considered to be the very far left of where you could go in terms of the discussion on Palestine. And the shift that has happened now is that Americans for Peace Now is quite rightly seen as a quite racist anti-Palestinian Zionist organization. And Yitzhak Rabin is seen quite correctly as an unrepentant, unreformed war criminal. And the point I want to make is that that sea change has happened despite the media dominance of the mainstream narrative, despite the escalating censorship, and despite the, I would say, the increasingly heavy-handed censorship that we are all facing, and that many of the speakers before me outlined in detail. And so I want to offer that as a piece of good news, that the censorship is there. It is very strong. It is in ways getting more sophisticated and more heavy-handed. But the point I want to make is that we are not powerless. The fact that we are fighting, the fact that we are often speaking only from the margins, and sometimes only to each other from the margins, may at times seem like a futile endeavor. It can sometimes be very tiring to feel that we're sort of speaking in the wilderness, but the cumulative effect is very real and very measurable. And that I want to offer that as encouragement to us, not to be in despair because of the very real phenomena, the very real censorship that we are facing from tech companies to the Labour Party, but as further encouragement to keep up the fight. And it seems to me, the lesson that we've learned, if we didn't already know it, I think some of us knew it, maybe some of us didn't want to know it, and I certainly don't claim to have known all this, but it's very clear that the idea of liberal democracy that we've been sold in the West all our lives is really a lie, in the sense that the powers that be, the governments that exist, the monopoly or duopoly parties will never allow, as long as they have the power to stop it, they will never allow an electoral challenge to their power. They will never allow real socialists, real progressives, real left-wing ideas to win fair and square in this system. We've seen that through the sabotage of the Labour Party, the sabotage of the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn by the Israel lobby, but not just by the Israel lobby, by a whole confluence of powers and interests. And we've certainly seen it in the United States, where even the very mild social democratic challenge represented by Bernie Sanders was really crushed through very unfair and very underhanded means. And I think, I'm not sure what the answer to that is, but I think the starting point is we have to recognize that reality in terms of thinking about how we go forward. But the one message I hope people will take away is that the powers we face are awesome, but we are not powerless in response. We can resist successfully, and we can keep winning people to our sides. And that's what I think we have to keep doing.
Thank you very much indeed, Ali, for those, again, more inspirational words. We've only got 6 or 7 minutes left, so I've just been asked to try and put a few questions, if I can, to the panel, but if you could just keep your answers to about 30 seconds or a minute, otherwise we'll be over time. And just perhaps first of all to you, Ali, as I know you've got to shoot off somewhere else, and you gave a very hopeful and inspirational contribution there. If there was one thing that people watching the program this evening could do to address these attacks on free speech and to, I suppose, force our representatives to actually, do something about it, what would you recommend them to do? What would that be? What would your advice be?
Gosh, that's a hard one to do in 30 seconds. But I think the key thing, Marc Wadsworth said it earlier, solidarity, the critical importance of solidarity with each other and with those who are being under attack. There is a conspiracy of silence in the mainstream media about what's being done to Julian Assange. I think that we must not be intimidated. We have to speak our minds. We have to continue speaking our minds in a principled way, and we have to stand by each other when we're attacked. I think solidarity is absolutely fundamental to our ability not just to defend ourselves, but to move forward politically.
Thanks very much indeed for that, Ali. And once again, thank you for your excellent contribution this evening. Just in the last few minutes, and perhaps if we could just maybe go to Ben now, and there's a question here from Jonathan Cumberbatch. He's saying, how do we get past the limitations imposed by this system and its various methods of communications? He says he sometimes thinks people have such suspicion of information via the web. Would it be better posting flyers in the street? He's saying. I mean, I don't know what you think about that, Ben, but what would your thoughts be to Jonathan's question there?
Yeah, it's a good question, and unfortunately, I don't know the answer. I think this is an answer that needs to be really thought about a lot by activists and journalists and people around the world, because it's an international, very deep problem that we're all facing. My cursory thoughts are, just in response to that, are: one, I think we need to have more conversation about social media platforms, and not just conversation. I think there needs to be actual policies set, because the reality is that these public social media platforms are controlled by private for-profit corporations that are Western government contractors. And I think there needs to be not just a discussion around, but also legislation passed that clarifies the role of these platforms, because as Ali said, these are not just optional platforms at this point. They're deeply integrated into professional life, into people's education, people's social lives. If you don't have a social media platform in many contexts, it's in this digital world, it's like you don't even exist. So it's not just a matter of personal choice, because the way, especially in the US, but with neoliberal ideology, it's become very common for these governments to talk about personal choice, and these companies have the right to ban certain people from using their platform. But it's not nearly that simple. And the reality is that there's no regulation of any of these social media platforms, which actually, in a kind of contradictory way, ends up giving us the worst of both worlds, because there is no government oversight over these social media corporations. They can do whatever they want, and at the same time, they are very sensitive to requests by U.S. police and Western police and intelligence agencies to censor information, because they're afraid if they disagree, if they do not agree to censor that content, that there might be regulation coming down the road. So we saw this with Facebook, where Mark Zuckerberg was forced to testify before a congressional committee on so-called Russian disinformation in the election and supposed Kremlin meddling in the otherwise perfect U.S. election. And Zuckerberg was clearly just bending over backward to play ball, because as some people, some Congress members brought up as a possibility, regulation could be on the table. The reality is that I think in the middle term, that's a short-term solution. In the middle term, these corporate monopolies need to be broken up. I mean, it's absolutely insane that Facebook and Google rather control. These are some of the largest corporations on earth. They have larger revenue than many countries' entire GDP, and they control billions with a B of people's access to information. How many people around the world use Gmail and other Google products? How many people around the world use Facebook? 2 billion people. So, and WhatsApp, again, the most popular messaging app in the world. The solution, unfortunately, I don't think the solution is just boycotting these social media platforms, because the reality is, although, yes, I think we should encourage the rise of other independent social media platforms that aren't going to be beholden to Western government interests, the reality is that very few people use Mastodon, very few people use Minds, very few people use these other platforms. Of course, I have profiles on all those other platforms, and I think we should try to build them up, but we can't just disengage from where the majority of people are. And the majority of people are using Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. So we saw the beginning, I think, of this topic being broached with the scandal around TikTok in the US. TikTok is owned by a Chinese company, and because it's not owned by a US company, the US government freaked out, and some other governments, including the Indian government, has banned TikTok and a host of other Chinese-owned apps, even though they're owned by Chinese companies, some of which are actually private. But because they're Chinese, they have to be banned. And there's not that narrative around these Western social media platforms. They're treated as if they're neutral arbiters, as if they don't have the same kind of censorship and oversight that Chinese apps have. But the reality is that they very much do. And that needs to be part of our conversation. And it's not just a matter of talking, because discourse management is not going to get us far enough. We need to begin talking about it and then organize around it and push toward particular political goals. And I think, again, that goal should be regulation of these massive corporate media monopolies. Which
brings me to another quick question before I go. I mean, we're actually out of time, but just quickly, this is an important one because it's linked to what you were just speaking about there, Ben, from one of the viewers is saying, is there a way for progressives to establish their own media that doesn't rely then on Facebook, Twitter and Google? You kind of sort of alluded to that, but if you could be very brief though, because I say we are out of time now. I mean, I'm sorry about that, but we are. So
yeah, it's a really good question. The reality is I think we have to do both. We have to try to build up independent platforms while also engaging with the ones that exist, because look, I help run an independent website, and we get I think around 15,000 views per day. And if you look at the traffic, more than half of those views come from Facebook and Twitter. About a quarter come from Facebook and a quarter come from Twitter. And then about 40% come from Google. That's just the reality. And we have some people from DuckDuckGo. We have some other views from other websites and other social media platforms and search engines, but it's very minimal. The vast majority of our traffic comes from Google, Facebook, and Twitter, because these Silicon Valley corporations have monopolized access to information and monopolized the internet. They are uncontrollable, unregulated corporate monopolies. And even though they're U.S. companies and U.S. government contractors, billions of people around the world use them. So there needs to be not just a national conversation in the US, but an international conversation about internet sovereignty, the right of access to information, and regulation of these corporations, because they're already working with the US government and other Western governments, but they're doing it in a non-transparent way that's not democratically accountable. If there were actual democratic regulation and we knew what the regulation was and what their policies were, I think they would actually be more democratic platforms. Although in the long term, again, I think they need to be broken up.
No, that's really useful. Thanks very much indeed, again, for your contribution tonight, Ben. And we've made a contribution to that international conversation, and we need to continue that and to keep pushing. We are out of time, but I did say that I'd give all of the panelists an opportunity to respond. And I'm just going to put one question out to the other three panelists, if they have anything to say about this. And this is from a viewer who said, what do the panelists think about Keir Starmer saying he's not a Zionist, but supports Zionism without reservation? Perhaps start with you, Tony. And we'll have to be very brief because we're 2 minutes over time already.
Well, if he supports Zionism without reservation, I think you can define him as a Zionist. There is no doubt Starmer is a Zionist, but he's more than that. He's a member of the deep state, a member of the Trilateral Commission. Yeah. He is as reactionary as one gets, and it throws a question mark over Corbyn's judgment, the fact that he was ever in the shadow cabinet, especially as he was part of the chicken coup. But Starmer is also a racist. He talked about a Black Lives moment. If you don't oppose and if you don't take on imperialism and colonialism, which is where racism comes from, that marks you out as a racist. And there's no doubt that Keir Starmer is a fully fledged racist. Let's face it. He is a defender of British capitalism, come what may, and capitalism is the source of racism. So that's my view.
What's your thoughts then about Keir Starmer saying he's a Zionist but doesn't support Zionism without reservation? What would you say, Mark, on that? You still with us, Mark?
Yes, I'm still with you. I don't shirk this issue at all. My book's 252 pages long, so I don't just talk about Israel, anti-Semitism, and Palestine, but 2 of the pages, look at my preface, 2 of the pages are about this central issue of settler colonialism, which is a stain on the world. And so I think, you know, we talked about alternatives to what's there at the moment. Have a look at my website, thelatest.com, Britain's first dedicated citizen journalism website, a fantastic forum for the fight back and those conversations. And in books are important as well. And
yes,
that's why I wrote this one.
No, indeed.
And I hope people will go out there because it offers a sort of roadmap of optimism, of hope, of how we can fight through insurgency. We can mount a fight back against all these reactionary forces.
From that, I take it you don't think very much of what Keir Starmer was saying about not being a Zionist, but supporting Zionism without reservation. Then let me move to Jackie. Then Jackie, just get your thoughts, and then we'll have to wrap it up for this evening. What's your thoughts on Keir Starmer's remarks there?
My thoughts on it. This is dissembling. I mean, this is the trick that he does all the time. You know, today he said something about commemorating Black History Month, while at the same time compensating people in the Labour Party who appear to have been quite racist against Black MPs. This is called dissembling. I think we know who Keir Starmer is, and we know very clearly what he supports. He's the person who put Ruth Smith in front of us and said she is the person that should be emulated. That tells us all we need to know about Keir Starmer.
Thanks very much indeed. Thank you everybody for watching this evening. Apologies that we've gone slightly over time. We've gone well. Actually, normally we're just on air for an hour. We extended it for half an hour because of the breadth of the topic that we were discussing and the fact that we've got 5 guests on the program. I hope that those of you that have stuck with us have enjoyed it. Please join us next week on Resistance TV on Wednesday at 7 p.m. when we will be discussing the post-furlough scheme that the government has put in place in response to the COVID crisis. We've got another excellent panel, Kerry-Ann Mendoza, who is the editor of The Canary, Jyoti Brar, who is the deputy leader of the Workers' Party, Ian Hodson from the Bakers Union, and Steve Headley from the RMT. So please join us next week, and thank you for tuning in this evening, and good night.